welcome to a new episode of IG Live with your Dietitian ASTRID NARANJO. And today I have the honor to interview an amazing guest that we have been waiting for, Naiman. And I've got a lot of interesting questions for him about protein, insulin resistance, energy toxicity. There's going to be a lot of information today that you guys need to be here to listen to. I'm going to wait until he joins so we can start the interview. Some of the things that I'm going to ask him today: personal fat threshold, is it possible to reverse diabetes type 2, the difference between insulin resistance in different tissues. So that's something that we could understand and know a little bit better. Waist to hip ratio or waist to height ratio. Blood tests, for example, what to look when it comes to metabolic health, hedonic foods, and how that can affect people's behavior when it comes to choosing their foods, especially in a fat loss phase, where these things can be very controversial. The other things that we want to know is protein leverage theory, PE ratio, and how to calculate that. Some thoughts on fiber, and also things that perhaps he has changed in his mind over the years of his experience. Hello.
Hello, how's it going?
I'm very, very excited to have you, Ted. This is a really good time that I've been waiting to ask you so much questions. You have so much knowledge that I want to extract today. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
Well, ready to go.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Love it.
So let me ask you something. I know you have been doing this for quite a few years, but why medicine? Tell me a little bit about what made you choose this career in the first place?
Oh, wow. I really wanted to be an engineer, and I got an engineering degree, and I kind of wanted to do aerospace or something engineering, and then I just couldn't get a job, and kind of as a whim, I applied to medical school. It's not something I had always dreamed of doing. Some days I'm not sure how I ended up in medicine. It wasn't like I always wanted to be a doctor. So, but now that now that I'm here, I realize, well, since health is probably the single most important thing that anybody has in this life, I'm glad I chose it, and I would choose it again in a heartbeat, because honestly, health is probably the most important thing. If you don't have your health, you really don't have anything.
I agree, absolutely, 100%. Now, I have been reading your book, and this is something that I have come across, that so much information and so many images and slides, and I think there is so much information that we can unpack today. And one of the things that caught my attention was about a concept you utilize a lot, that is energy toxicity. So tell me a little bit about why did you come up with that concept, and how do you apply it into your practice?
Well, I like the energy toxicity concept, because if you look at people with metabolic syndrome or prediabetes or diabetes, what's going up in their blood that we're measuring is glucose, right? So everyone's familiar with glucose. Glucose is too high. But the other thing that a lot of people aren't looking at is the fact that there's also too much fat in the bloodstream. There's too many triglycerides. There's too many free fatty acids. And if you look at your whole body, what you really have too much of in your body is fat when your blood sugar is too high. And so, and then I realized that you can contribute to this energy overload in your body with either too many carbs or too much fat, either way. And that's why I really love the energy toxicity concept, because it's basically too much either fat or carbohydrate in your body, which could be manifested as high triglycerides or high blood sugar, or overexpansion of your fat cells, and then your fasting glucose goes up. And so I like energy toxicity because it kind of incorporates both the excess of refined carbs and refined fats that contribute to most of the obesity and diabetes that we see.
So when we talk about that particular concept, are we referring specifically to obese population? Who are we talking about when we refer to that concept?
We're really talking about anyone who's overfilled their fat cells.
Okay.
And some people don't have very many subcutaneous fat cells, so they might actually look really lean, but they still maxed out their energy storage. And so that's someone who could be pre-diabetic or even diabetic at a very low actual amount of body fat. So this whole concept of energy toxicity is frequently associated with obesity, but you don't have to necessarily look obese to have this.
Okay, so I think that leads really good to the personal fat threshold that you refer to a lot. What is that? How do you, whoo, you left.
Oh, sorry. my cat is causing problems, so.
Oh, that's all right. I was just mentioning about personal fat threshold and how it might relate to insulin resistance. So what is that? What does that mean?
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So you have a certain number of fat cells in your body, and fat cells can expand in diameter, and your fat cells might be maybe 10 microns in diameter and up to 200 microns in diameter, and the amount of fat they store might go up by several thousand-fold. But once you've expanded all your fat cells, you start trying to make new fat cells, but some people really can't. It's very, very genetic. A lot of people from Southeast Asia, for example, China or India, they're very limited as to how many new fat cells they can grow. That's adipocyte hyperplasia, where you sprout new baby fat cells. Not everyone can do that. And once you've filled all your fat cells to their maximum diameter and they can't get any fatter, the fat that you eat that's circulating in your bloodstream has no place to go. And then your body tries to store it anywhere it can. You might get visceral fat storage. You might get ectopic fat storage, where you just shove fat anywhere you can. But eventually there's too much energy circulating in your bloodstream at all times. That is fat energy, triglycerides, and free fatty acids, but then also glucose, because your cells refuse glucose because they're too full of fat, and none of your cells want that glucose. So now you've got too much energy in your bloodstream at all times. That's when your insulin's chronically high, because insulin is trying to clear the bloodstream of energy. So this personal fat threshold explains everyone we see with metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, or even diabetes at all sorts of different body mass indexes. I've got patients who are 400 pounds and they're not diabetic at all. They could still get a lot fatter. I have patients who are, maybe 12% body fat and they're fully type 2 diabetic. Usually they're from Southeast Asia. But the personal fat threshold explains all of these findings. And if you look at someone's fat cells under a microscope, you'll see that they've actually gotten as big as they possibly can. And that is exactly correlated with fasting insulin and fasting triglycerides and fasting blood sugar and energy toxicity. It's all a straight line. The diameter of your fat cells tracks exactly with your fasting insulin level.
Is there any correlation between personal fat threshold and body fat set point? Or nothing to do?
Not really. I mean, most people have a body fat percentage set point where their body is comfortable with that, where they have enough leptin to not be really hungry. But almost everyone's going to have that set point below their personal fat threshold. Nobody's body really wants them to be energy toxic and diabetic. So they're not necessarily correlated together.
Okay. Do you feel, especially in your practice, maybe you've seen this, can you reverse type 2 diabetes at all?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You can completely reverse it. So you have to do two things well, first of all, you can normalize your A1C by just eating less and getting thinner. But if you really want to completely get rid of your diabetes, where you can eat carbohydrates or you can eat anything you want and you have really good metabolic flexibility, you have to do two things at the same time. You have to increase your skeletal muscle mass and decrease your fat mass at the same time. You have to shrink down all your fat cells so you have plenty of storage headroom to put incoming energy. And you have to increase your glucose disposal, and that usually means having more muscle. So almost all of our diabetics have way too little muscle and way overexpanded fat cells. They basically have sarcopenic obesity, where their muscle is way too small and their fat is way too big. And you have to do body recomposition and reverse that and get more muscle and less fat if you want to completely cure your type 2 diabetes. And to me, a cure would be normal blood sugars without any medication, and also the ability to eat carbohydrate or fat or whatever and be able to dispose of that incoming energy without major blood sugar problems.
Okay, and when you refer to trying to do that body recomposition, do you mean like it should be happening roughly at the same time? Especially this population that when they start exercising, they obviously see these changes pretty quickly as compared to someone who is like an advanced trainee that has to have a lot of different factors available at the same time for that to happen. Do you think is that something that tends to happen quite quickly when someone starts exercising resistance training, especially we're referring to someone who is overweight or has a lot of body fat percentage to lose?
Yeah, I think that can actually occur quite quickly. Most of my diabetics have not been doing a lot of resistance training, so they get a lot of newbie gains when it comes to building muscle. And because when you're insulin resistant, it's actually way easier to lose weight and lose fat. As long as you make the right changes with diet and exercise, you can actually reverse your diabetes very rapidly.
Why there are so many people that might say the opposite? Why insulin resistance makes losing fat harder? For example, someone with PCOS or someone who has a metabolic syndrome or something like that. Can that make it harder? What is happening there?
It's literally easier to lose fat if you're over fat and insulin resistant. It's actually your rate of fat loss is higher. And in fact, the thinner you get and the more insulin sensitive you get, the harder it is to lose fat. And I think a lot of people know this instinctively. Like you see someone who's really, really overweight and they go on a diet and they might lose 10 pounds the first week, they might lose 20 pounds the first month. But when you've gotten down to just your last 5 pounds over your weight loss goal, it's going to take you a year to get rid of those last 5 pounds. It's harder and harder and harder to do. And we see this in bodybuilders and fitness models. As they get leaner and leaner, your body holds on to those calories so much more, and it's so easy to put on new fat. Your fat cells are so insulin sensitive, it's very easy for them to store energy. So it actually gets harder to lose fat as you get thinner and more insulin sensitive. It's easier when you're 100 pounds overweight. I think a lot of people say, oh, I struggle to lose weight because I'm insulin resistant. That's the exact opposite of what's really going on. And it's kind of an excuse. I hate to say it, but it's really like, it's an excuse that's totally invalid.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like, well, I need to blame something, not necessarily be accountable for what I'm doing, my choices, things I am in control over. So there is usually people say, well, what about even being high insulin resistant, but also like, could that affect my basal metabolic rate or the speed I can lose weight, or maybe the insulin resistance that when I'm eating carbohydrates or things like that, it's actually increasing my hunger levels and I am not getting the signal. So what could be happening there that people are just saying insulin resistance makes me more hungrier?
Well, so the truth is that people who are really overweight, usually their basal metabolic rate is a little bit higher, and usually they have more caloric expenditure when they do exercise, just because they're having to work more. And so there's pretty much no good excuses there. Like, any way you look at it, your rate of fat loss, your basal metabolic rate, your caloric burn with exercise, they're all higher when you're obese. So that's not a good excuse. Now there are good excuses. If both your parents were obese, if your mother had gestational diabetes and was overweight, you might have been exposed to a lot of insulin in the uterus. You might have adipocyte hyperplasia starting out. You might have more fat cells than everyone else. You might have a higher body fat percentage set point. Maybe your whole childhood, people gave you poor food choices and you had a lot of programmed obesity and you always had more fat cells than everyone else. Now, that's a legitimate excuse. You have a higher number of fat cells and you can shrink all of them down maybe halfway and be a little bit less fat. But when you try to go below that, you're going below your set point, and you really struggle. Your leptin gets really, really low. Your ghrelin goes really high. So you definitely struggle to get as thin as someone who doesn't have genetic obesity, who doesn't have programmed obesity, who didn't have childhood obesity, who didn't sprout a whole bunch of fat cells. So there's tons of good excuses. It's like, my parents were fat. My mom was fat during her pregnancy. I had junk food my whole childhood. I've always been obese. That person is going to have way more fat cells. They can shrink them all down the same as a thin person, but they'll still look fatter. They'll still have a higher body fat percentage. They'll still have a higher body fat percentage set point. It's going to be a lot harder for them. Now, those are all really good excuses. You can totally use those for excuses. Anyone who's genetically thin parents, never had a lot of fat cells, they're going to have a lot easier time getting down to a lower body fat percentage. And that's not fair, and it is totally genetic, and genetics are a big deal. And those are good excuses. But you can't just say, because I'm so fat, I can't lose weight because I have slow metabolism or because I'm insulin resistant. Those are not good excuses, because those actually make it easier for you to lose weight.
When you talk about insulin resistance, is it possible to like pinpoint where the insulin resistance can be? Like, is there like insulin resistance at the level of adipose tissue and maybe not at liver or the peripheral organs? Or is it when you have insulin resistance everywhere, or is it in the muscles?
In order to have full body insulin resistance, you have to be insulin resistant at both the fat cell and the muscle cells. So basically, you have to lack room for storage in fat tissue and in muscle. You can lower either one of those and your insulin sensitivity goes way up. Like if you did glycogen exhaustion workout where you just sprinted for an hour and depleted all the glycogen out of your muscles, your whole body insulin sensitivity will go up very acutely, even though you really didn't shrink your fat cells at all. So in order to be diabetic and full body insulin resistant, you have to have insulin resistance at those two major storage depots, the muscle and the fat cells. In order to be fully insulin sensitive, you also want to have insulin sensitivity at both of those tissues as well, fat and muscle. The way you get more insulin sensitive in your fat cells is to literally shrink the diameter of all your fat cells. And the way you get more insulin sensitive at your muscle is A, have more muscle, and B, deplete it. Glycogen depletion, intramuscular triglyceride depletion with exercise, cardio, high intensity exercise, just anything that burns energy out of your muscles.
That's so good. All right. I love that you say you gotta resistance train, you gotta exercise to actually build the muscle in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, I think they forget about that component on like the excuse is, well, I just can't exercise because I feel like I have this. Okay, there's the point here. People come and say there's like a battle inside when you have large amount of weight to lose, but at the same time you have no energy, or there's a lack of trying to stay adherent to a program or something like that. How could someone start and actually find that consistency without giving up? Because I think that's something that tends to be very common, and is either the problem of being able to stick to it, or it's just like they are so tired, they don't know how to manage their fatigue, or how to go about it.
Well, I do admit that a lot of people who are really overweight and really insulin resistant, they have to start losing weight first before they just have enough energy or motivation to do exercise. So for people who are just starting out, I'm like, just try to do some walking, you know, pay attention to your step count, try to get some walking in. And what you see is as people start losing fat and the energy arrow starts going the other way, like before they're just partitioning all the energy into fat storage. Now the energy is coming back out of fat storage. These people spontaneously get more energy and they start to exercise spontaneously. And we've all seen these stories where somebody goes on a diet, loses some weight, and now all of a sudden they're just more motivated to exercise, and their exercise just goes up organically, naturally, automatically. And so I do think it's most important to start with diet first. And then I think as people start losing weight with diet, they have this energy, they can tap into this energy to exercise. I think if you tried to just start with exercise without doing anything with your diet, it's probably going to fail. So you really do want to do diet first and exercise second. But in order to be optimally healthy, you absolutely have to exercise, and you have to do two specific types of exercise: resistance to hypertrophy your muscles, and some sort of cardio to regularly deplete all the energy from your muscles, the glycogen. And that's really what it's going to take, I think, to be optimally insulin sensitive and optimally healthy.
You mentioned a lot waist to hip ratio versus waist to height ratio. Is there a difference between these two? Why do you choose to use waist to height ratio?
Right. I like waist to height ratio because it's just a little bit better. If you look at how well these two different ratios, there's waist to hip ratio and waist to height ratio. Waist to height ratio performs slightly better when you compare it to tests of insulin sensitivity like HOMA-IR, homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance. If you look at insulin and you look at these ratios, the waist to height is slightly better. There's also gender issues with waist to hip ratio. Like women are supposed to have an even smaller waist to hip ratio than men, and it just makes it a little bit more difficult to work with. So I really prefer waist to height ratio. And so the most important measurement is your waist circumference, definitely.
Do you have to use specifically inches or centimeters, or it doesn't matter?
It's unitless because you're dividing the waist circumference by the height circumference. So you could use any units you want. You can use microns, millimeters, kilometers. It doesn't matter. They cancel each other out.
Perfect. All right, let's move to the next question. And this is about blood tests. Generally, what do you look for when it comes to metabolic health that are actually reliable indicators that your metabolic health is in a good place?
Probably my favorite cheap basic test is fasting triglycerides. So fasting triglycerides are awesome. If you fast for 12 hours and you check your triglycerides, triglyceride is fat energy that's circulating in your bloodstream because it doesn't have a good place to go. And you can really, really get a good flavor for how insulin sensitive someone is by how low their fasting triglycerides are. if your fasting triglycerides are over about a 115, you're probably insulin resistant to some degree. And the higher that gets, the worse off you are. I mean, I see people whose fasting triglycerides are, 200, 500, 1,000, 10,000. I think the highest I've ever seen is 20,000. But it just blows up if you're like severely diabetic. So fasting triglycerides is awesome. The textbook says you want to be under 150. You really want to be for sure under 115. Honestly, you should be your goal should be under 100 for sure. And to be elite, in my opinion, you have to be under 70. So my goal for anyone who's really trying to get an A plus is to have their triglycerides under 70. So that's probably one of my favorite tests of all.
Okay. If you after having that one, would you have any other that you will be looking at to sort of like, well, if this one is sort of okay, what else could that flag me that something is going on?
Well, fasting insulin is excellent. Fasting insulin, a lot of doctors won't order it though, and it's sometimes kind of expensive and hard to get, and nobody really has to do this. It does correlate very well with fasting triglycerides, and it also correlates very well with waist circumference. So nobody really has to get a fasting insulin. But it is kind of helpful. It is kind of cool. Average is 8 or 9 in this country. Lower is better. You really want to be below a 5. You really, really want to be below a 3 if you're going to get an A plus. And there's quite a bit of wiggling in fasting insulin, though. Like if I just massively overate for a couple days, my fasting insulin might go from a 2 to a 4 or something. So you can acutely skew it with just how much overeating or undereating you've done recently. Like if I fasted for a couple days, I can drop it significantly. But so waist circumference is almost like how high what your fasting insulin has been for the past, 3 months or something like that. So waist circumference is to fasting insulin what like a A1C would be to a fasting glucose. You know what I mean? That's why most people can really just go with waist circumference, maybe triglycerides, and don't necessarily need a fasting insulin. It does get helpful though if you're genetically low fat cells, like if you're from India or China or Southeast Asia, and you kind of look thin and your waist is not that big, and you really want to know where you're at, then a fasting insulin might be quite helpful.
What about HbA1c or like LDL cholesterol or HDL cholesterol? Are they any indicatives that they are like good or not so good to metabolic health?
Well, I love A1C, and honestly, I draw an A1C on just about every adult in my medical practice. So A1C is excellent. I absolutely love it. It's a fantastic measurement. There are some genetic factors. If you have a certain type of hemoglobin and your red cells live a little bit longer, your A1C might hang out a little bit higher than some other people whose A1C might be a little bit lower. But all in all, A1C is a very good measurement, and it's a really good way to track how you yourself are doing. You can follow your A1C over time, and you'll see it creep up if you're over fat, and you'll see it creep down if you're nice and lean. And it's a really good way to track your progress over time. So I do love hemoglobin A1C. That's a great one to check. LDL is not that helpful. You can really acutely raise or lower it based on how much energy you're getting from your diet or how much energy you're getting from your fat cells. So if you just fasted for 3 days and ran a marathon every day for 3 days, your particle count will explode, your total cholesterol will go way up, your LDL might go way up. These are all going up because you're trying to get more energy from your fat cells to your other cells. Versus if you just eat tons of glucose all day, day after day for days, you'll drop your total cholesterol and your LDL and your particles because you don't need to transport as much fat energy around your body. So it's a little bit misleading. and it's not the best way to track. I have a lot of people who really improve their diet and start exercising and lose a lot of weight, but their total cholesterol might be slightly higher and their LDL might be slightly higher. And I don't think it's correlating well with their overall health.
I've heard a lot about there is a slight difference between like different patterns of LDL in your blood. So sometimes you could have a high LDL, but it's probably a healthy pattern because it's been correlated with maybe just a higher saturated fat intake, but might not be dangerous as compared to LDL that it's even smaller and has been glycated with carbohydrates when you have insulin resistance. Is there any difference in these two patterns? So like if you have a high LDL, but it seems to be like a uniform pattern, is that going to be relatively less worrying or less dangerous when it comes to cardiovascular health or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this pattern A versus pattern B lipoprotein or LDL particles. So your LDL particle could be really large and fluffy and harmless, or these tiny little dense particles that are more associated with atherosclerosis. And you really want to be pattern A. And to be honest, getting the particles sizes actually measured with like an NMR lipo profile is very expensive, probably not that helpful. What really correlates amazingly well with LDL particle size is triglyceride. You can draw a graph of pattern A versus pattern B and your fasting triglycerides. And if your triglycerides are over 150, you're just 100% pattern B. You've got small, dense LDL particles. It's bad. If your triglycerides are under 100, if they're under 70, you're 100% pattern A. Like, you're just awesome. So you can really almost look at fasting triglycerides all by itself and tell what LDL particle pattern you have. And that's why, once again, I just love fasting triglycerides. I mean, this is definitely, in my opinion, the most important number in your lipid profile. HDL is good, and I do like triglyceride to HDL ratio. There's a lot of genetic factors to HDL. I have Asian patients who they'll never get an HDL over 40. Like, they could be just super thin, super healthy, super active, like perfect health, and maybe their HDL is a 40. And then if they have severe insulin resistance, their HDL is a 20. But they'll never get like my HDL, I think my last one was a 90 or a 95 or something. And certain races of people will never get a number that high. So it's kind of hard you have to take this major genetic factor into HDL.
Okay, awesome. When we think about body fat, not all body fat seems to be equal. So there are some essential body fat and there are some that are not as essential. But beyond this, is there any good of having a higher level of body fat that is not the essential type?
Well, so your body tries to store fat subcutaneously, and then once you've kind of maxed that out, then you start storing visceral fat and ectopic fat. Ectopic fat is fat where it doesn't belong. That's always bad. Visceral fat is usually bad. So provided you haven't maxed out your subcutaneous fat stores, there's definitely an amount of fat that is advantageous to health. For example, if you get too lean, if you shrunk down your subcutaneous fat cells too small, your leptin goes way down, and then your fertility just shuts off. Your body says, okay, there's not enough food in this environment, so we're absolutely not going to try to reproduce here. Women won't ovulate, men won't make testosterone, there's no reproduction happening. And that's really smart. That's for a good reason. It's like, okay, if you're in an environment without enough food, the last freaking thing you need is somebody else to feed. So it's just not going to happen. So you really don't want to go down below this crucial body fat. For men, it's probably 9 or 10%, maybe higher for some people who have just a higher set point. For women, it's definitely like, 18%, maybe 20. 22. It's different for everyone. Everyone has a different body fat set point that their body is comfortable going down to. And that's very genetic. But there will be this level where if you try to go below it, you're cold and you're tired and you're weaker and your sex hormones are lower and your libido's down and you're have amenorrhea, maybe men will have low testosterone. So body fat is definitely on a U-shaped curve. If it's too low, you're actually going to be weaker, you're going to have less skeletal muscle, your bone density starts to go down because you're not putting enough weight on your bones when you walk around, your strength drops, your endurance goes down, everything kind of gets worse. But then if you're over fat, the same thing sort of starts happening in the other direction. So it's like a U-shaped curve, and you want to be right in the middle of the U. And nobody can decide what that is for you. You have to figure that out kind of on your own. Just like, where do I feel the best? As you get thinner, you get hungrier and hungrier and things don't work as well. As you get fatter, things don't work as well either, in the opposite direction. And you're just trying to find the right spot for your body.
That's so true. And I guess a follow-up question of that would be, someone who is obviously in a dieting phase and fat loss phase, do you know that you're going to a certain point to be a very lower body fat percentage? But how low could be too low? You say that it is very individual. Someone could just figure that out on how they feel, their biofeedback. But would you say, or have you seen a pattern of, well, perhaps going this far is probably not the best way to go about, and maybe in men or women, less than 10% body fat? Like, it is very individual, obviously, but like a rough pattern, what would be your thoughts on that?
Got it. Okay, so it's extremely dependent on genetics, and it's extremely dependent on how fat you've ever been. So if you were really, really obese and you had, let's say you had twice as many fat cells as someone else, let's say you can shrink all your fat cells down to 50% full. But if you try to go lower, your leptin's too low, you're too hungry. So you have someone has twice as many fat cells as everyone else. They shrink their fat cells down to 50%. Well, they're going to have a 20% body fat, when someone who has fewer fat cells might have a 10% body fat, and they both have the same leptin level. So that's their body fat set point, right? That's the point where if they try to go below, they're going to be hungry and they're going to be cold and they're going to be tired. And it's totally genetic. It's very, very genetic. So like, you'll see people who have super lean parents and they're just super lean all the time. I've got, male patients who are 8 or 9% body fat all the time, and they're not even trying to diet. And they probably couldn't get a whole lot fatter even if they tried, even if you paid them. They just can't do it. So there's this huge genetic variability. It depends on what your parents look like. It depends on your how fat you were in the past. But I would say, just like average, just if I looked at all my patients or all the people I work with overall, like a really good set point for men is maybe 12%. I would say a lot of men, that will be the center of their U-shaped curve. And for women, maybe more like 20% or so will be this center of the U-shaped curve, where you're fit enough that you have excellent insulin sensitivity, but you're not so thin that stuff starts going wrong or stops working. So just really rough ballpark. I kind of like this 12% for men and 20% for women, but it's like so individual. You really can't, that would just be on a population level. At an individual level, that all goes out the window.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. And looking at your practice and like all the years that you've worked with people in your clinic, how often or how likely has been to find someone with high levels of body fat, but they are still in a perfect metabolic health, meaning that they have no metabolic syndrome whatsoever or insulin resistance? Is there a good amount of people that can be in that place?
Not really. So if you look at body mass index and insulin on a big population level, it's this perfectly straight line. And the fatter you are, the more insulin resistant you are. So it's very rare. There's very few outliers where they look like they're going to be insulin resistant, but they're really not. It's quite uncommon that that happens. Most of the time, you can just look at someone and look at their waist circumference and have a good idea how metabolically unhealthy they're going to be. And it's actually quite rare that someone is that obese and they are still very insulin sensitive. But I have seen that does happen. It's rare, it's an outlier, but I see super thin people who are actually diabetic, and I see super obese people who are extremely insulin sensitive. Very rare. Usually it tracks with BMI linearly.
It might just come across because this question comes because there is this health and exercise movement that there is a lot of people that say, well, BMI doesn't matter. You can be overweight and still be healthy, but how overweight can you be and still be relatively healthy? Weight might be sometimes bearing on your joints, on your actual physical health rather than your metabolic health. But how much can this happen for you to be clear of being sick, maybe over time or chronically being affected in your health by being overweight?
Well, even if you're metabolically healthy, being obese is going to play a role in your overall health. Your heart has to work harder to pump your blood through all of this extra fat. So there's definitely negative impacts on health if you're over fat and metabolically sensitive. And for the most part, on a statistical level, the higher your fat mass over a certain point, the more likely you are to die of anything. Morbidity and mortality just goes up in a straight line as people get higher and higher fat masses. So you really don't want to be obese, even if you're metabolically healthy. And I don't really like the health at any size. Well, I like trying to achieve health at any size. Like if you're looking at health at any size as a mindset where no matter what size you are, you want to be as healthy as possible, and you're going to work on your diet and your exercise. But that usually is going to imply some amount of body recomposition, less fat, more muscle for anyone. So I would say health at any size is a good way of encouraging anyone at any size to get as healthy as possible, but it's probably going to include fat loss if you're really looking at it honestly.
And that's the problem. I think that's where they're trying to steer away from. Is like when you're in a health of body size movement, you don't have to, we don't encourage body fat loss, or we don't encourage weight loss. And that's where it becomes a little bit tricky, because if someone who comes into this movement wants to lose weight, they are pretty much expelled because they are trying to be different to the actual movement that is trying to sort of invite acceptance, and like you have no room to lose fat anymore. It's like, just give up, just accept how you are and where you are, and that's it.
Yeah, well, then I think that's probably bad. I just can't agree with that at all.
Let's move to the next question. And I think I've heard you talking a little bit about tracking your macros. Do you actually believe macro tracking as an objective way to lose fat and adjust your fat loss progress, or can you just go and get away from tracking and lose weight still in an objective way? You can definitely lose weight without tracking macros, but I mean, utilizing this as a tool to be more objective when it comes to tracking and looking to adjust the progress of as long as you go.
So, okay, like honestly, 99.99999% of my life, I have not tracked my macros. And the same percentage of the time, nobody on the planet is tracking their macros. And most people are not going to track their macros. So if your approach requires long-term macro tracking for success, then it's not going to work. It's bad. It's going to fail. However, I love tracking macros, and everyone should do it at least temporarily just to know what the hell they're eating. Everyone should learn how to track macros. Everyone should do it for a short period of time. And you really want to know what the heck you're eating right now, like exactly what you're eating, how many grams of protein, how many grams of fat, how many grams of carbs, how many calories. You should track what you're eating now just for even a week or two. Like 2 weeks would be plenty. Figure out how to do it, what the hell's in food, what the hell you're eating, and then tweak it a little bit. And by tweaking it, I always mean higher protein and lower energy, right? Always, 100% of the time. And then, so once you know what you're eating and you know how to do it and you're aware of it and you make some changes and you're aware of those, oh, now it's like hitting the win button. Like you're just going to be successful. It's worth its weight in gold to know these things. So knowledge is power, and macro tracking is extremely powerful. And once you've learned how to do it and you've done it for a little while, you basically never have to do it again, and you're just going to be successful. So macro tracking is crucial, and I love it, but you don't have to do it very long.
Yeah, I agree. Now, there is a problem sometimes when it comes to weight loss and hunger management, and like looking at the choices we make and the things we're surrounded with. For example, someone who is or has been already losing weight for a while, what do you think about how could you incorporate some hedonic foods or highly palatable foods that has some combination of carbohydrates and fats and can make it so hard to say no to it, to someone who is lean versus someone who is trying to lose weight and is starting on a very, very high body fat level?
Right. Well, I think that you have to be realistic. And realistically, everyone's going to eat some junk food. Everyone's going to eat some total garbage. Everyone's going to, cheat. And I don't like to think of it necessarily as a bad thing or cheating. To me, you've got foods that have a really high satiety per calorie, and then you have foods that have a really low satiety per calorie. So like your salmon and your salad is going to have a super high satiety per calorie, and your donut's going to have a super low satiety per calorie. And I think that what you want to do is go out of your way to front load all these high satiety per calorie foods. Plan on eating them, go out of your way to eat them first. And then you will probably have room for a little bit of the low satiety per calorie foods, but you have to be very mindful of it. And you have to eat it with a lot of intention, and you have to realize that it's probably going to drive overeating hedonically, and you don't want to have a lot of that around. And you might want to eat that at the very end of the day so you don't have as far to fall after you eat it. And you want to eat your protein and fiber first so you're not as hungry. So like my style might be, I'll eat, a pound of, fish or lean beef or skinless poultry or something like really protein, and then like just a salad the size of my head. And then after I've gotten all of this protein and all these micronutrients, okay, then I'll eat like a donut for dessert. And, I make sure I don't have a lot of it in the house. I might just go out and buy one and eat it. And I'm very mindful, and I realize that this is a low satiety per calorie food, and it is addictive, and it does trigger overeating. And I have to do it with a lot of intention, and I have to do it with the mindset that this is a low satiety per calorie food, so I can't eat as much as I'd ever want of this, you know what I mean? But I think that as long as you've got like a 90-10 or an 80-20, most people can fit that into their diet. And the whole point of the PE diet is to basically front load all this protein and fiber and minerals and micronutrients, and then have some extra energy on the back end if you have room for that. And I think most people can get away with that. Now, there are some people who are so addicted to the dopamine spike of high energy density carbs and fats together that they have to just never eat that, like an alcoholic who might never drink alcohol. But I would say that's the minority, and most people can have a little bit of it, just like most people can have a glass of wine or one alcoholic beverage or something like that.
For those that might don't know what satiety means, what do you mean by satiety or high satiety food?
Right. I mean how hungry you're going to be several hours later. Like, you eat this food, and how hungry are you going to be 3 hours later, 4 hours later, 5 hours later? An example of a very high satiety per calorie food would be protein and fiber, fish and salad. You eat a pound of salmon and a salad the size of your head. You're not hungry for the rest of your life. Like, you're extremely not hungry. Your downstream satiety is very, very high. But if you just drink like a glass of orange juice, which might have the same number of calories, you might be hungrier 3 hours later than if you had never eaten anything at all. So that's got horrible satiety per calorie. Or you eat a donut, which is probably going to have the same calories as the salmon and the salad. 3 hours later, you're definitely looking around for more food. And so this has a very low satiety per calorie, or maybe almost slightly negative satiety per calorie.
Okay, got it. Now, it's funny because I can include myself into this boat. When I eat fish, like, I think I need to eat a very big bowl of fish to actually feel like I am done. Like, I pretty much could eat a pound or a little bit more of fish and still feel like I need to eat more of this. And that's protein. So would it be that it is very individual how much satiety you get from specific foods? Or is it the size of your stomach that might contribute to how it expands or how it contracts, that it might tell you some signals to your brain, well, this is enough. Maybe you have more capacity in your stomach and then you have to eat more of it. How do you manage these in the type of foods or even in the quantities, especially for someone who might not feel satiated, even if they're eating high protein, high fiber foods, they can still fit a lot inside?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is totally individual. And nobody's going to be able to tell you what combination is the very best for you when it comes to satiety per calorie. I have patients who need a high protein percent, but then they need most of their remaining calories to come from fat rather than carbs, and they're just way fuller. So they might eat ribeye, they might eat steak and eggs, they might eat poultry with the skin on it, dark meat poultry. They're going to eat a higher fat because they have way more satiety downstream. Other people need a higher carbohydrate intake, so they might want a leaner protein and then throw a bunch of carbs in it. So they're having their chicken breast and their potato or their rice or something like that. And I think everybody has to find out exactly what combination of these macros works for them. I think the only thing that is universal is, number one, protein percentage. So for most people, the higher you crank the protein percentage, the less calories you're going to automatically eat. And the other thing is energy density of the food. If the energy density is lower, you're basically going to have more fullness with less calories. And by energy density, I mean like how much calories you have per weight of food or volume of food. So if you're just eating like, spinach, you can eat like bale of spinach. It's like this big and it's like 10 calories or something. So you're going to have more fullness from that versus, just like butter. You have like one little thing of butter and you might not get very much satiety from it. It's just tiny and it has higher energy density. So I think that protein's universal, energy density is universal. But after that, you have to figure out what carb and fat mixture works best for you.
That's perfect, the answer. Now, let's get into something very interesting that I want to hear your thoughts on. And how do you suggest, especially when we think about these carbs and fats, high carb, low fat, and this ongoing battle with nutrition and this religion and dogmatism, how do you suggest that someone could just go in the middle and try to just start stopping that extremism of going to either one, this is the best diet, or carnivore is the best, or keto is the best? What do you say about that?
Okay, so we have this eternal war between low carb and low fat, low carb, low fat, low carb, low fat. It's just a massive war. The low carb people inevitably have more of a carnivore approach because animal foods, in order to get enough protein in a low carb approach, you automatically have to eat more fat. And then the low fat people automatically sort of gravitate towards plant-based because plant proteins have a lot more carbohydrate inherently. So you've got plant versus animal and low fat versus low carb. And these two warring factions, I think they're really just two sides of the same coin. I think they're actually exactly the same. What they're both doing is a protein to energy approach. And if you're getting all your protein from plants, there's so much carbohydrate that comes along with your protein. You know, if you're eating lentils and beans and you have so much carbs along with your protein that you have to eat low fat just to be a normal weight. And then if you're eating animal foods, there's so much fat with the protein you're getting that you have to be low carb to be successful. So it really just depends on where you're getting your protein. Now, if you look at it from a protein to energy standpoint, you can flex your carbs or fats depending on your protein source. So let's say I'm eating chickpeas for protein, right? It's a pretty reasonable food, very high protein percentage, pretty good nutrient density, but there's just a shit ton of carbs that comes along with it. So I have to be low fat with that meal if I'm going to be successful. So I'm going to eat that with like no fat at all. But then let's say I'm just eating a giant piece of red meat. I'm eating a steak or something. There's so much fat in that I really can't eat any carbs with that. But it's okay. I can go either way. I can have a meal of chickpeas that's super low fat. I can have a meal of ribeye that's super low carb, and I can have success either way. And what you're really looking at it from is a protein to energy ratio, and you can go back and forth, and you can pick and choose, and you can have the best of both worlds, and you end up just as successful as someone who's just ultra religious. I never eat fat. I never eat animals. I'm just plant-based. Or someone who's like, okay, carbs are evil. I never eat any carbs. And as a result, I'm just eating butter and steak and eggs. So I think that it's a mistake to really shove yourself 100% in either of these camps. I also think that everybody is going to get the highest satiety per calorie with some amount of fat and some amount of carbs. Like if you try to go below 20% of your calories from fat, we see testosterone dropping in men. We see sex hormones being too low in women. You never want to go below 20% of your calories in fat. You probably want to be more like 25 or 30% of your calories from fat. Same thing happens with carbs. When people eat, zero carbohydrate whatsoever, they have this sort of low-grade carb hunger all the time, and they end up having to eat way more fat to try to satisfy that when they'd actually be better off just eating maybe 100 grams of carbohydrate. Humans have an appetite for 5 specific things: protein, carbohydrate, fat, sodium, and calcium, these minerals. So you really, really want to make sure that you're getting some fat and some carbs and some minerals and some protein. And that's the only way you're going to get total satiety at the lowest calories. And so I think it's a big mistake to just say, I'm never going to eat any fat, or I'm never eating any carbs. What you want to do is be sort of low-ish carb and low-ish fat. Like I'm eating, 100 grams of net carbs a day, and maybe like under 100 grams of fat and under 100 grams of net carbs. And I just try to keep protein really high at 200 grams. And I think you can have the best of both worlds that way.
How do you calculate protein and energy ratio? And how can you ensure, like, how can you give us some examples of how would that look like if it's a high PE versus a lower PE ratio?
Gotcha. Okay. So the PE ratio is grams of protein divided by grams of non-protein energy, which is net carbs and fat. So like, let's say your low-fat string cheese has 6 grams of protein at 0 carbs and 2.5 grams of fat. And it's going to have a PE ratio of 2.5 or something like that. So it's just this general idea of the amount of protein in a food divided by the amount of non-protein energy. And that's net carbs, or carbs minus fiber and fat. And there's no exact numbers here. Like, it's all relative. You're just looking at foods that are higher and foods that are lower. So like the standard American diet is at a protein to energy ratio of 0.25 or something. because 60% of our calories come from grains, wheat, rice, and corn. We just eat just tons of refined carbs, refined fats, sugar, flour, oil, all this garbage. There's all this protein dilution. So we have this super low protein energy ratio. And then what you want to do is, instead of picking an exact PE number, which is ridiculous, you just want to be higher than you are, right? Like, so you look at what you're eating. Oh, I'm eating, a donut for breakfast. Well, maybe I could eat steak and eggs, and that would have an even higher protein energy ratio. Or maybe I could eat a really lean steak, like sirloin and eggs. Or maybe I could have 2 eggs and 2 egg whites and a turkey bacon or something. And you can always go higher and higher and higher. So the very, very lowest PE ratio would just be a pure refined carb and a pure refined fat, like sugar and oil. You know what I mean? In fact, the average person's whole metabolism, their whole daily BMR could be run off of the calories in a half a cup of sugar and a half a cup of oil. So you could just eat a half cup of sugar, a half cup of oil, you're done eating. You've got this extraordinarily low protein energy ratio. You're going to be absolutely starving. You got no protein, no minerals. The energy density is absolutely the highest with these refined carbs and refined fats, and it's a nightmare. Or you could go the exact opposite direction and eat like egg whites and spinach and all these foods that have hardly any calories, hardly any carbs or fats, but just tons of protein, tons of minerals, tons of satiety per calorie, really low energy density. And every food you eat, it lies somewhere on this spectrum from super low to super high. And you can just look at what you're eating and try to aim a little bit higher than you are.
So ideally, the higher the PE ratio, the better, and the lower, the worse.
Exactly. Basically, the higher the PE ratio, the thinner you're going to be. And this scales all the way up and down from like your extremely elite bodybuilders. You'll see them eating nothing but egg whites and whey protein and salad with no dressing, and the PE ratio is insanely high. They might have a PE ratio of 2 or 3 or 4, all the way down to like really, really obese people will be below the standard American diet of 0.25. They'll be down at like a 0.15. They're eating so many donuts and ice cream and cakes and cookies and pies and muffins and crackers and bagels and garbage that their PE ratio is just like extraordinarily low. And they have to eat so many carbs and fats to get enough protein to not be hungry that they are just way, way, way over fat.
Let's talk about vegetables, because they can be a little bit tricky because they low in protein, but they also low in calories. How do you suggest to go about these specific foods, like vegetables that are lower calorie but low protein as well, or like fruit, like berries, strawberries, blueberries? They sort of low calories, low carbohydrates, but they have no protein at all either.
Well, green vegetables actually have a super high protein to energy ratio. So if you actually calculate the protein energy ratio of spinach, it's way up there on a par with like chicken and beef. And actually, most green vegetables have a higher protein energy ratio than just ribeye steak or egg. They're really, really high. Asparagus, spinach, these green vegetables have an extraordinarily high protein energy ratio. So they're phenomenal. Now, fruit is a little bit different. Most of your high sugar fruits have a very low protein energy ratio. And to be honest, I think high sugar fruit is a good way to get some extra carbohydrate in if you need that for your training or for your exercise or something. But it's probably not the very, very best choice for someone who's energy toxic and who's really trying to work on this PE ratio. So I think low sugar fruit is great. Green vegetables are amazing, like just as good as meat. And everything, all your plant foods are somewhere on this spectrum, from super high, like a green vegetable, to super low, which would basically be a high sugar fruit.
Okay, gotcha. Now, let me hear your thoughts about eating fiber and health. I've heard that from certain people, fiber is not necessarily necessary for health, but on the other side, it is. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think fiber is not necessary, but I think it's helpful because of the satiety per calorie. So for example, let's say you and I both eat a steak, right? We both eat the same steak, but then you eat like an entire head of lettuce, and I don't eat any vegetables because I'm like a religious carnivore or something. Well, you're going to get higher satiety per calorie than me because, later on I'm going to be a little bit hungry and I'm going to be eating like, I don't know, cubes of raw pork fat or whatever like religious carnivores eat when they're still hungry. And it's probably not going to be optimum for satiety per calorie. So I think people who never eat fiber are leaving a lot of money on the table when it comes to a low energy density food with high satiety per calorie.
What are your thoughts on artificial sweeteners, Diet Coke? Do you feel like they can be a very useful tool for fat loss, or what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I think that if you're using an artificial sweetener in a 0-calorie food, like a beverage, they're totally fine. So like diet soda, I have no problems with this. Aspartame, it's actually fairly safe. It's metabolized into just naturally occurring amino acids. It does not seem to be toxic. The studies on this stuff is actually pretty good. And I think if you have a 0-calorie product, like a Diet Coke, if you're just drinking a Diet Coke, I don't have a problem with that. I think it might actually satisfy a sweet taste craving that some people have without any calories. So, no calories, no problem. I do think that if you are making like a keto treat where you just have, 10 sticks of butter and a gallon of oil and a block of lard, if you just pour artificial sweetener all over that, you're going to be able to eat a little bit more of it. And it's probably not the greatest in a food that's already highly caloric. So I'm not crazy about like a ton of like high calorie keto snacks that you've sweetened just to keep it low carb, you know what I mean? So I have like I think artificial sweeteners are basically fine, but I'm a lot more excited about them in a 0-calorie setting.
Yeah,
Like a
no,
beverage.
it definitely can trigger to eat more if you're already eating something that is high calorie
Mm-hmm.
already to begin with. How would you be able to explain cravings? Someone who struggles with cravings, how can you manage your cravings to a point where you're still able to get away from them successfully on a consistent basis, especially if you struggle with that every day?
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, a couple things. First of all, some of these cravings might be the fact that you really are still needing more protein, more micronutrients, more minerals. You might like legitimately need some raw materials that you're just not getting. So I wouldn't say, totally ignore these cravings. But then on some level, some of the cravings are really just the addictive dopamine spike you get from high energy density carbs and fats together, like a donut or something like that. I think personally, for myself, the best way of dealing with them is to eat something that has just tons of protein and minerals and nutrients first, and then eat whatever food I'm craving. Like if let's say I have a dozen Krispy Kremes in my kitchen, and I'm like, okay, I'm definitely so eating one of those tonight, right? I will intentionally, before that, I will eat, a huge salad, a can of salmon. I'll eat like a protein shake. I'll have just some voluminous, high protein, high mineral, high nutrient density food. And then like, half an hour after that, or maybe somewhere downstream from that, I might eat like this donut because I know I'm just going to eat one and stop. You know what I mean? It's a lot more manageable. if I didn't eat these other things, then I'm going to eat the whole box of Krispy Kremes, and I'm just going to feel like garbage, and it's just going to be bad. So I really like front loading these micronutrients so that you're giving your body everything it might need, and then your cravings are just so much more manageable.
Can you have a lot of, like, maybe is that cravings related to deficiencies, or maybe on the other side you could be like, because you are getting used to eat those things so much that your body actually craves for more of it? Where do you see it in this place?
Yeah, so in the book, we talk about these three types of hungers. There's a nutrient hunger where, you're just going to eat until you get enough protein and minerals. And then there's an energy hunger where if your fat cells are pretty small and you really need some more leptin and you just need more calories, you're going to be hungry for energy. And then there's this hedonic hunger where you just know how good you feel, how much your brain lights up when you eat pizza, right? And donuts and these high energy density carbs and fats together. And so in the book, we talk about these three hungers and why your best strategy every time is to just go out of your way to completely fulfill the first hunger, the nutrient hunger, with this protein and minerals and nutrient density. And then you're in a lot better place to say, okay, how much of this do I still need extra calories, or am I just really craving this hedonically? But no matter which one it is, you're not going to be successful unless you got the first one taken care of, the nutrient hunger.
Okay, got it. Processing food is all bad?
So I used to think that processed food was bad, and the answer was just eat whole foods. That has to be it, just eat whole foods. And then I realized, well, no, humans have actually been processing food for 100,000 years. Like, humans are cuisinivores, which means we evolved to eat cooked and processed food. And you're supposed to take your animal and butcher it and cook it and process it. We've been soaking and sprouting our plant foods. We've been cooking all our animal foods. And historically, before the Industrial Revolution, when you processed the food, actually the nutrient density went up and the bioavailability of the nutrients went up, and the everything about processing and cooking your food was better before the Industrial Revolution. Like, you had higher bioavailability of protein, more micronutrients available, you had fewer parasites, you had less chance of food poisoning or something like that. You denatured plant toxins by soaking and sprouting and cooking and all these things. So now I think that processing is good as long as it increases nutrient density. Where processing is bad is if it just decreases nutrient density by giving you more refined carbs and more refined fats. And that's like sugar and oil. So sugar and oil is a way of taking a food, stripping out all the nutrients, and just leaving you with the energy. So in that case, processing has decreased nutrient density, increased energy, and you've just refined out all the energy, the refined carbs and the refined fats. So I don't really like refined carbs and refined fats, but I love refined protein. I love cooking and processing my food. I think that's 100% good. So you have to decide which kind of process, whether the processing has just stripped out all the energy and that's all you're eating, or whether the processing has improved the nutrient density.
Is there any difference when you are over 40 in women's in terms of eating carbohydrates, the certain type of carbohydrates, likelihood of insulin resistance in this population?
I think that as everybody gets older, we see less and less skeletal muscle and higher body fats on average. So most people, as they get older, like women, for example, their estrogen is lower, their testosterone is lower, their body composition might be getting slightly worse, less muscle, more fat. Your basal metabolic rate might go down a little bit. And all of this just becomes a little bit harder and more important. But I think your same goals are exactly the same, and your strategy is exactly the same, and the approach is exactly the same. You're still trying to get the highest lean mass at the lowest fat mass. You're still trying to increase your protein to energy ratio. You're still doing resistance and cardio. everything you're doing is the same. It just gets a little bit harder hormonally, I think. But I wouldn't change a thing.
I agree with you. And I think the problem seems to be that menopause, perimenopause can be a little bit of a challenge in these situations. And women might feel like, if everything is changing, what should I do about my lifestyle, about my diet? Is it something that I should be doing to reduce the suffering around this period, or just make it better for my aging?
Yeah, I actually wouldn't, I would not give any different diet advice to a postmenopausal woman than what I would give to a younger woman or a man or anybody at any stage. It's still the same. It's still all the same approaches. If you're trying to get leaner, it's a higher protein to energy ratio. You're always trying to do more resistance exercise, more cardio, highest lean mass, lowest fat mass. Not going to really change. It just might get a little more difficult after menopause, because your testosterone is literally lower and your estrogen is literally lower, and these sex hormones automatically give people better body composition and a higher basal metabolic rate. So it's a little harder, but it's still the same approach. I wouldn't say to change anything.
I agree. And I think you could get away relatively by having some hormone replacement therapy if that was a need for it. So you can sort of re-stabilize your hormones.
That's true. Yeah, I think that's a totally reasonable approach. So that's definitely a strategy.
I agree. Ted, I think we've gone through so many questions, and this has been really amazing. Got to pick your brain for a little while. Thank you so much. I really, really can't recommend enough to go in and checking out your book about the PE diet. And you have it in Spanish as well.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Oh, that's going to be amazing for people that needs to love your content but also don't speak English.
Right.
Tell us 3 tips to improve our health, lifestyle, and be a more balanced humans.
I think number 1, pay attention to what you're eating and try to increase your protein percentage. I think number 2, it's make sure you're doing cardio and resistance exercise. You want to be able to do that for life. And number 3 is just sustainability. You know what I mean? It's like, make sure that what you're doing is sustainable, because you got to do this for the rest of your life. You want to be able to exercise for the rest of your life. You want to be able to work on your diet the rest of your life. So all these changes have to be sustainable. You don't want to be on like some, 3-week boot camp or some super crazy thing that you can't do for you. If you can't picture yourself doing it for 6 months, forget it, because you're going to want to do this for the rest of your life. And so it's consistency, protein, and exercise.
Amen. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ted, for your time. I really appreciate this.
Great. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
All right. See you. Thanks.